Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. A hot afternoon in Sacramento, California, sometime around 1915, a man steps off a train. He hasn't been here in years. He walks calmly down the platform, just another face in the crowd, just another traveler, and no one gives him a second look. Except one man, standing half a block away, watching. The officer doesn't hesitate. He crosses the street and walks straight toward him and says the man's name. Not the name on his ticket, not the name he's using now, but his real name. The man freezes. The color drains from his face because he knows there's only one man in Sacramento who could have recognized him. A man he hadn't seen in 15 years. A man they called the Camera Eye. The officer smiles slightly and says, "I've been wondering when you'd be back." His name was Max P. Fisher, and he never forgot a face. Well, hello. I owe you an apology for this long hiatus. Thanks for your patience. I wanted to release this in February, and of course that didn't happen, but here we are. And this is a long story. There's no getting around that. Part of the reason for the silence. But it's one I've wanted to tell for years. You'll understand why soon enough. In episode 3, the Kovalev story, I mentioned a young Sacramento detective appointed in 1894 to help investigate the Weber murders. An elderly couple stabbed to death in their apartment above their grocery store. That detective was Max Peter Fischer. He was a 32-year-old German immigrant and an expressman, a horse-drawn taxi driver. What I didn't know then was that Fisher had already served as a special officer 2 years earlier on the Chin Hain case, Folsom's first execution, which I covered in episode 2. Well, by the end of his career, Max had been involved in roughly 19 of Folsom's 93 executions, or at least the crimes that brought them to the gallows. Given his 40-year career in Sacramento law enforcement, that's not surprising. What is surprising is how few people today have ever heard his name. On October 5th, 1930, the Sacramento Daily Union wrote, "Many of the criminal identification experts who have journeyed long distances to meet Captain Fisher have been surprised at his small stature. They have come to Sacramento expecting to meet a large man of domineering personality. Instead, they meet a rather small man who might and often does pass in crowds unrecognized. To the casual observer, he might be a clerk in a dusty bookshop or a humdrum hardware store. But the close observer immediately recognizes an unusual and compelling personality." You're going to hear some pretty extraordinary things about Max P. Fisher. Things that may sound exaggerated, even unbelievable. I'm confident they're true. And by the end of this episode, you may find yourself wondering why his name isn't better known, especially in California. He shaped Sacramento law enforcement, influenced legislation, earned international attention, and then somehow slipped quietly out of public memory. Part of that, I think, was intentional. Max was profoundly humble. He avoided credit, distrusted praise. Accolades didn't interest him. The work did. Doing it well mattered, and doing it honestly mattered more. I've known his name for 20 years or so, but only through the stories of the men executed at Folsom whose crimes occurred in Sacramento. Over time, I realized I needed, to know more about the detective who kept appearing in the background of these stories. So I started digging, year by year, newspaper by newspaper, document by document, case by case. And as I went, this man unfolded. His life and what he accomplished was astounding. I now catch myself asking, more often than I expected, what would Max do? By the end of this story, I hope you'll be asking that too. So let's begin. Maximilian Peter Fischer was born December 21st, 1862 in Germany. He immigrated to the United States at 14 and became a citizen 11 years later. He said 2 moments set him on that path. As a boy, he watched the Prussian army march into his Bavarian province. One afternoon, walking home from school, an officer knocked the hat from his head and demanded to know why he hadn't removed it for a general. Young Max told him he removed his hat only for his father. The officer kicked him to the ground. About that time, he said, I had been reading of Abraham Lincoln, and a sympathetic teacher explained every word of the Gettysburg Address to me. Those 2 incidents made up my mind. Some accounts say he came alone, others say with family. What is known is that his mother later joined him in Sacramento, where she lived with him for a few years before her death in 1903. In 1884, at 21, Max started his express business, parking his red wagon near 2nd and K Streets in Sacramento, a prime spot beside the train depot. Max said, instead of going into a saloon for a drink of beer or a game of cards, as other expressmen did, I sat on my wagon, always ready for hire if someone wanted trunks, merchandise, household goods moved. And while I sat there, I studied law. He also studied faces, and he remembered them. Some newspapers claimed his grandfather was a Swiss detective and his father a German police chief. I couldn't confirm either. What is certain is that Max had a deep fascination with crime and criminals. He subscribed to detective agency bulletins and magazines, and he memorized fugitive photographs and built his own records collection, handwritten notes on the backs of voter registration cards that he stored in a shoebox. His memory did the rest. He knew criminals. He knew the comings and goings of Folsom's inmates. And before long, police began listening when he spoke. Reporters did too. Max gave them details, accurate ones, and he could tell a hell of a story, a reporter's dream. One reporter would later write, when Fischer tells a story, he gets a twinkle in his eye. If it's a nice story, he smiles, but if it's a sad story, he almost cries. He holds his hearer's interest and makes the thing he is telling more real by the twinkle or the tear in his eye. This ability would serve him, and many others, throughout his life. It was more than charm. It was persuasion. At first, officers in Sacramento's very small police department laughed at him. They called him an amateur detective. And then one day, while riding with a reporter, Max abruptly stopped the wagon, mid-sentence, mid-story. He had just spotted a fugitive wanted in Kentucky. He found an officer, and the man was arrested. His shoebox files confirmed the identity. And just like that, the laughing stopped. Permanently. And so it began. Newspaper accounts piled up, hundreds documenting Max Fisher's unnerving talent, recognizing faces from memory, even after 30 or 40 years, sometimes just from a glance. Years and whiskers are no foil to the keen eyes of Max P. Fisher, one article declared. In one case, he studied a lineup of 60 men, walked directly to one, called him by name, and told him to step forward. The man denied it. Max took him to his library and produced a photograph, taken, quote, in Sacramento 18 years ago when he was a beardless boy. The beard hadn't fooled Max, and the man confessed. Another time, a vagrant ordered out of town passed Fisher as he left the courtroom. Max stopped him. Your name is not Reese. It is George Brown, isn't it? And your mother's name is Sarah. The man denied it. Max asked if he'd ever been in Oklahoma, and he said he had. That settles it. You are George Brown, who, 3 years ago, escaped from the Jackson Penitentiary. You still had 18 months to serve. This was all proven correct. When asked about it, Max explained it simply. As soon as I saw that peculiar ear, hardly noticeable to most persons, his name and crime came to me. A small deformity in the right ear. That was enough. It always was. In April of 1892, the police chief hired Max as a special officer, someone brought in when things got hairy, a major murder, a crime surge, an unsolvable case. In this instance, it was the Chinese Tong Wars, which I talked about in episode 2, and Max was involved in the Chin Hain investigation, Folsom's first execution. Decades later, Max mentioned one detail to a reporter in a 1937 article about the case. Hui Yen Sing, the man convicted alongside Hain, who received a life sentence, was paroled after 15 years. Max said, he never got in trouble again as far as I know. He didn't say it like trivia, and that wasn't a throwaway comment. It mattered to him. He remembered the outcome when most detectives remembered only the arrest. In the 1890s, train robbers and river pirates kept law enforcement busy and frustrated, but Max is credited with bringing many of these major players to justice. Criminals were mobile, aliases were easy, and records were spotty at best. But he was stubborn in the best way, by doing something radical for the time, waiting, camping out for days, living undercover, disguising himself and blending in until the moment arrived. He was endlessly patient and unnervingly intuitive. Maybe it came from studying criminals for years, learning their habits and patterns that had given him a kind of internal map where people fled, who they trusted, which mistakes they always made. He didn't rush. He didn't guess. He just knew where to look, whether he was chasing a fugitive or hunting down stolen property. It's like he had the mind of a computer. In early 1895, Fisher was still officially working as an expressman, but moonlighting as a special officer, working the Weber case, as I mentioned earlier, along with other major murder investigations. Things were good for Max. He married Louise, worked as a deputy for the county sheriff, and his name began appearing in papers alongside phrases like clever capture. An 1895 reporter wrote, Mr. Fisher has shown himself to be a detective of more than average ability. A year later, Another called him developing into one of the most skillful thief catchers in the state. In 1896, he was assigned to monitor the state fair, a known magnet for pickpockets and grifters. For Max, it was less an assignment than an all-you-can-eat buffet of familiar faces. And everyone wanted Max on their team. He worked for the county sheriff and was referred to as Deputy Fisher. He also served as a special officer for the police. And then in October of 1896, the district attorney created a position just for him, county detective, a job that had never before existed in California, at least I think, certainly not in Sacramento. In those days, district attorneys often did their own investigating with the assistance of the sheriff. Having someone do that work full-time, professionally, was unusual. But Max's methods were paying off. The evidence he collected, whether from meticulously kept records or his attention to detail at a crime scene, made for solid cases. Solid cases often meant confessions, and that meant trials were avoided and taxpayers saved money. But just as important was how he worked. He rejected the so-called third degree, which was common practice at the time. He believed in treating people humanely, not because it was soft, but because it worked. Long before the phrase existed, Max practiced what we now call procedural justice, fairness, transparency, respect. The simple idea that people are more likely to comply when they believe they're being treated justly. The golden rule. Not as philosophy, but as method. That was Max. He said, "Nothing is gained by the use of harsh and brutal words or actions in dealing with a prisoner, even though he may be a hardened criminal." One of the early examples comes from February of 1894, when he reported for night duty as an officer with the Sacramento Police Department. The Sacramento Union wrote, "Officer Fisher reported for duty last night, armed with a baton about 1.5 feet long and made of the hardest and heaviest wood that grows. After hearing the opinions of old officers regarding the result that would follow a blow from it upon some fellow's head, Fisher concluded to go forth into the night without it." That choice, quiet, deliberate, and deeply intentional, he knew he didn't need it. That tells you almost everything you need to know about Max Fisher. And that's when I knew there was really something about this guy. It became part of his legacy. Toward the end of his long career, a reporter wrote, "Fisher won the goodwill of scores of men whom he helped to bring to justice for crimes committed. Possibly it was because he kept promises made to them. Possibly, too, it's because they knew he was strongly opposed to the, quote, third degree and never secured a confession by such a brutal method. He played fair." One safecracker, a yeggman, as they were called, said, "I tried to lie out of it. I told him he had me wrong, but I had to come clean. He had me, but he's square, a square shooter. He'll tell you the truth and play the game square. They know him in the East. You'll hear the yeggs in New York talking about Max Fisher of Sac." In the mid-1920s, Floyd Hall, an alleged murderer who had been on the run, took Fisher's hand after his interrogation and said, "Captain, you are the squarest man I ever met. No other man has shown such an interest in me." Max didn't just arrest men. He understood them. His reputation for treating everyone with respect preceded him because suspects would often refuse to talk unless it was with Fisher. Still, how did Fisher get suspects to confess? It baffled those around him because harsh treatment was seen as the best way to break a man, to get the truth, or as many only cared about, a conviction. One observer said Max used moral persuasion rather than brute force. Another described it this way: Captain Fisher uses a system of questioning suspects that many dread more than physical punishment. Seating the suspect, the captain fixes his unblinking gaze upon one eye of the person being questioned. He does not glare, he does not stare, but into the one eye of the suspect he pours the concentrated force of both his cold blue eyes. Adroitly, he questions the suspect. The person being questioned is encouraged to talk, and all the time, the captain's two eyes gaze unflinchingly. In a few minutes, the criminal becomes restless. He shifts in his chair. His mind becomes confused and wondering what strange power this questioner is exerting upon him. He falters in his story, and sooner or later makes some fatal slip or admission. And almost without exception, when the questioning is over, the criminal admits he has never before been subjected to that form of test. Another said, Fisher's theory is based on the axiom that mind rules matter. His aim is to bring terror to the mind and ignite the spark of decency which he claims exists in every man. To this, Max explained, to do these two things, one must first awaken the subconscious mind. Every criminal lies, and physical forces and everyday mind are linked together to make the lie stick. Brutality will only close the criminal up tighter than ever and make him concentrate his thoughts on the fact that he is lying and must at all costs make the lie stick. To awaken the subconscious mind, one must take the subject on a mental journey. Forget for the time being the object of the inquiry and ask ordinary, everyday questions. It is possible by this manner to get answers from him on two questions, one which you know he is telling the truth, and the other on which you know he is lying. Then you have the key, and the rest is but a matter of time. Gradually return to the crime and build up in his mind's eye an image of it. Watch every answer and trip him up on every lie. It may take hours and it may take days, but the system is infallible and will result in a confession in every case. All he had to do was listen. He let people talk themselves into corners. He watched their hands, their breathing, the moment their story required effort instead of memory. Max explained it another time, saying, I stare at him, focusing both eyes on one of his. Not a glower, but just a steady stare. After a while, the crook becomes worried. He begins to think I'm not believing him. And right then, he makes the fatal error of enlarging his story. Before he realizes, he has tangled things so completely he is lost. I let him reach the stage where he is fidgeting about the chair, and then I say, what's the use of telling any more lies? Come through now. And almost invariably he does. Don't you see the advantage of this system over the brutal third degree? It isn't hypnotism either. It's psychology. Max could also tell when a suspect gave a false confession, and often he had to go up against those who believed in a confession being a confession. Many were happy to call it a day, especially if the suspect had a criminal record. But not Max. He'd push back, determined to expose the truth and avoid injustice. Another piece of his legacy. People said he was honest as the daylight. A former colleague said, every old-timer in Sacramento will bank his last dollar on honest old Max to do that which is right. In all the long years he has so faithfully served the city, the finger of suspicion has never been pointed his way. Max believed decency lived in everyone, and he didn't just say it, he defended it. In 1893, when still an expressman, he wrote a letter to the editor of the Sacramento Bee responding to a minister who had condemned gamblers as irredeemable men. Max wrote to show, quote, that those awful, wicked gamblers sometimes possess better hearts and are moved with truer Christian feelings than lots of people who hold their hands up in holy horror at the sight of a gambler. To illustrate his point, he told the story of a destitute widow and her children, abandoned and sleeping out in the cold. Within minutes of the newspaper printing her story, a man approached Max and asked him to deliver money to her that he and his friends had raised. Max did, and he also helped her move into some shelter. The man returned with food, clothing, supplies. The day before Thanksgiving, he handed Max $10 and asked him to buy the family a proper meal. I may add here, Max wrote, that while everybody was made acquainted with the conditions of the poor deserving people through the columns of your valuable paper, outside of these men, nobody seemed to respond. By that time, the oldest boys got work through the untiring efforts of this awful, wicked man and his still wickeder colleagues, and the family got along all right. He ended the letter simply. Mr. Editor, this man of whom I speak has never been known to swear, chew, drink, or smoke, yet he is a gambler, has been an inveterate gambler for 40 years, one who spends from 8 to 10 hours every day in a place where the tiger roars the loudest. I will let the Reverend draw his own conclusion from the above, whether or not a gambler can be endowed with any of those feelings which he absolutely denies to that class. Very truly yours, M.P. Fisher, Expressman. Max never believed people were as simple as their worst act. He sometimes testified for defendants, not to help them escape justice, but to protect the truth. In one case, his testimony helped acquit 2 IWW men, industrial workers of the world. Some, I imagine, never forgave him for it, but he didn't care. He wouldn't lie. He wouldn't manufacture evidence. Integrity wasn't part of his job. It was the job, and it was a cornerstone of his character. Early in his career, people tested that. They tried to influence him, buy him, bend him. They learned quickly there was no point, because Max Fisher was never for sale, ever. Nothing irritated him more than injustice, especially the careless kind. He never hesitated to speak up, even when it could cost him. At one point, Max risked his job by speaking out against a notoriously corrupt police chief, his boss, who encouraged officers to, quote, beat the damn head off a suspect. There were plenty of other officers willing to do that. Max's impervious moral compass didn't always make him popular, as you'll see, but that was okay with him. Even city attorney Luke Howe frustrated him endlessly by often refusing to prosecute gamblers Max had the duty to arrest. He believed the law should apply evenly. He also noticed something others preferred not to. Chinese gamblers were prosecuted aggressively, while white gamblers were often released. And he said so. And by the way, Attorney Howe will weave in and out of these Folsom stories for the next 30-some-odd years. He was certainly another fascinating personality. As you might have guessed, Max also had something else rarely seen in his profession during that time: empathy. He rejected the idea that criminals were simply bad people. He had deep sympathy and empathy for addicts, not the dealers, but the users and the lives that led them there. He often asked judges for leniency, and judges listened. Max was meticulous, honest, and careful, so when he spoke, it carried weight. Sometimes he showed mercy long before a judge ever had the chance. While most officers would arrest drunks, even harmless ones, Max would just make sure they got home okay, especially the women. And one night, he and a fellow officer quietly followed a group of drunk men who were ambling toward the train tracks and made sure they cleared the tracks safely. Fisher told the story of Henry Bartholomew, a homeless man in, quote, the last of the vanishing group of dry land beachcombers who survived by scavenging coins and trinkets from the streets. But Prohibition had changed things. He said, Gone were the days when open-handed drinkers were careless with their money, when coins dropped on the sidewalks were numerous, and when the losers paid little heed to their losses. Bartholomew had managed to save a few $100s, but still slept in a crumbling shack in the river jungles. When an officer found him huddled in an alley and brought him in, Max didn't lecture him. Max talked with him, advised him, treated him like a man, not a problem. He always did that. If someone wasn't hurting anyone, Max saw no reason to push them along just to prove he could. The unhoused population understood this, and they trusted him. He had a particularly big heart for young offenders. He pushed for reform school instead of prison at a time when 13-year-olds could still be sent to San Quentin or Folsom. But even reform school troubled him. He believed the label could follow a child for life, robbing them of the confidence to ever stand straight again. In 1898, he was praised for protecting the identity of a young rape victim. The paper wrote, Fisher, guided by a slender clue, never permitted himself to rest until he had unearthed the fiend and had landed him behind the bars of Folsom Prison. Mindful of the fact that a revelation of the child's name might in time to come cause her great misery, Fisher sacredly guarded it from the public. The man confessed, and a public trial was avoided, as was exposing the victim. For his foresight and prudence, the paper continued, Max P. Fisher earned the gratitude not only of the parents of the little victim, but of every father and mother in the community. Protecting the young became part of his life's work. One early example came in 1892 when Max was asked to track down 2 young burglars who had robbed the offices of the Sacramento Bee. He suspected them, but they fled town. One eventually landed in Folsom, and Max knew where the other was, but waited until he had business that took him to that city. When he did, he found the boy. The boy confessed, and Max determined that the other one, the older boy, had gotten this one into it. The boy promised to reform, and Max believed him. For 2 years, they exchanged letters. Then in June 1894, the boy appeared unannounced in Sacramento and found Max at the police station. He had come back to repay what he had stolen. This happened more than once. It happened many times. Men showed up to confess, to repay debts, to make things right. Sometimes because Max had arrested them, sometimes he'd helped them. Sometimes it's simply because they had read about him. Max had given a man a quarter in 1906, and 14 years later, the man returned to Sacramento to repay him. So, back in October 1896, Max is county detective, and barely a few years into his career, quietly building his reputation of never complaining, sharing credit, and just doing the work. Then, in April 1897, he made the capture that changed everything. Max was on duty with the sheriff when he spotted James "Cuckoo" Collins standing on a Sacramento street corner. Collins was famous, a championship runner, sprinter, but also a fugitive. He was wanted all over the country. Specifically, he was wanted in Denver for a $10,000 jewelry robbery. His nickname came from his deceptive tactics in the sport of foot racing, a common issue. Like the cuckoo bird, known for discarding another bird's eggs from a nest and replacing them with their own. He fixed races, threw them, and then disappeared. Soon, the robbery. Law enforcement across the country had been looking for him for a year. Max had seen the wanted poster, and that was enough. Collins denied his identity at first, but that didn't last. According to a newspaper, quote, the persuasive eloquence of Detective Fisher induced him to talk, and he told the whole story. The paper added that Collins even complimented the officers for succeeding where, quote, very clever detectives, including the Pinkertons, had hopelessly failed. That mattered. The Pinkertons were legendary. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, founded in 1850, was a big deal, especially in the 1890s. And while the agency was known for their bandit chasing skills, it was also known for developing into a kind of violent, hired gun, union busting organization. Still, a big fish in a small pond. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to learn more about them. So this capture was also legendary. The Sacramento Bee credited his, quote, excellent memory and keen eye. Another paper wrote, now the notorious Cuckoo Jim comes as a crowning stroke to Fisher's many successes. Judge E.C. Hart paid Fisher high compliments, the recital of which might make our police force turn green with envy. The judge seemed to think it would be economy on the part of the county to have Fisher steadily employed. Collins trusted him too. After returning to Colorado, Collins wrote Max asking for legal advice. He encouraged him to plead guilty, which he did, and Collins received 2 years. Then he escaped and didn't resurface until 1904, when he tried to pass a fake check in Wisconsin. I'll include a link in the show notes to a short paper about Collins and the absolutely fascinating history of foot racing during those days. I highly recommend checking it out. Later that year, while Max walked to the stand in another case, a defendant grinned and said, and now comes Maximilian Pinkerton Fisher, the noted sleuth. I don't know if this was in response to Max's capture of Collins or just the fact that he was becoming known as, quote, one of the sharpest detectives in the state, but from then on, he became known as Max Pinkerton Fisher. By then, his life was full. He and Louise had a daughter they named Alice, and he was doing work he loved. He was very, very good at it. Criminals could change their names, their appearance, their lives, but not their faces. Max remembered those. He kept extensive files, his rogues gallery, and they were organized and methodical. Faces, scars, tattoos, deformities, criminal specialties, nationalities. He studied safecracking, explosives, all the methods and patterns. His mind mirrored the system. Everything in its place, just waiting to be retrieved. And he never stopped working. He would be fishing, walking, sitting with his family, and suddenly recognize someone from a description he read months earlier. No photograph, just the memory or an image of the written description. He'd bring them in and was almost always right. I say almost because, well, I assume he had a rare miss here and there. One escaped prisoner from Nevada took one look at him and said, "So you're a Fisher, eh? I guess I better admit that I'm your man then." Another time, watching men file past in a lineup, Max stopped one and told the chief, "This man here is a man I arrested 28 years ago this month for stealing 3 suitcases, and he got 90 days in the county jail. He was known as the Dixie Kid, a tough citizen." The man stared at him, then said, "This must be Max Fisher. He could be the only man in California who could know me. I've been out of the United States for 20 years and just came back." In court, Max rarely used notes. He didn't need them. Dates, names, details, they stayed with him. Judges relied on him. Attorneys depended on him. If Max was in the room, the truth usually was too. One attorney spent weeks searching for a particular file pertaining to an estate case he was working on. He mentioned it to Max, but had few details, just fragments. Max disappeared into the records room and returned with the correct file from 1885, nearly 10 years before he'd even been a police officer. Everything was running smoothly until November 1898. Max was on his way to Arizona to retrieve a suspect when politics intervened, as it often did. City government then was a loose arrangement of boards, favors, and grudges. Authority existed, but it wasn't always orderly. And where power gathered, so did resentment. Sheriff Frank Johnson, Max's ally, had just won re-election. His opponent, a guy named Morrison, sat on the board of supervisors, or board of trustees, and took the loss personally. He couldn't unseat Johnson, so he targeted Fisher. Morrison argued that investigating crimes was the sheriff's job, not the district attorney's. Why, he asked, was Fisher being paid by both? The argument was convenient. It was also misleading because Max's roles were different, and his pay evidently came from different sources. Bottom line, his results spoke for themselves. But it didn't matter. Morrison had the votes. Fisher's job as county detective was eliminated, and conveniently, the new district attorney, Morrison's friend, refilled the position with another friend, a man with no experience. Max returned from Arizona with his prisoner in custody, only to learn he no longer had a job with the county. He responded the only way he knew how, with restraint. He explained his duties, clarified the facts, and then said, "Some time ago, the different members of the board expressed their satisfaction of the manner in which I fulfilled the duties of my office, and I am greatly surprised at their action during my absence. I am pleased to learn that the board does not reflect upon my ability in the performance of those duties assigned to me heretofore. If the value of my services rendered in the past is considered inadequate for the salary received, the board certainly is the best judge of it, and if in their wisdom they concluded to dispense with my services, I am perfectly willing to step down and out." He didn't plead, he didn't protest, he simply stepped aside. The city wasn't so quiet. Judges objected. Citizens complained. Newspapers mocked the decision. They pointed out the obvious. Max saved the county money. His cases were solid. Confessions came quickly. Trials became unnecessary. Judge Hart said, "I declare that it will be a great loss to the taxpayers of this county if Fisher or some other detective of equal ability is not employed to aid in securing evidence against criminals. Fisher is a remarkably clever man in his line. He knows what value to put on a circumstance which would escape another detective altogether as of no significance. Moreover, he is something of a practical criminal lawyer in a way, and he knows just what sort of evidence is necessary to strengthen a case in court and ensure a conviction. Fisher has been a most valuable county officer." The Sacramento Bee agreed, writing, "It has long been a matter of comment among those having business around the courthouse that if there were any particular officer who earned his salary, County Detective Max P. Fisher was that man." Even one of Morrison's colleagues said, "I think Max Fisher is one of the most deserving officers in the employ of the county. He has been accustomed to spend considerable money out of his own pocket when hunting criminals. He did, often, money and his own time. He volunteered to patrol parks and city festivals. He supported charitable work and joined organizations like the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. He believed the job extended beyond the badge." Fortunately, being well-liked and a master at what he did, his unemployment didn't last long. In January 1899, the mayor appointed him a full-time officer with the Sacramento Police Department, a department that needed him badly. Max arrived carrying his records with him, his personal archive of criminals' faces and histories. He went to work immediately, going after illegal gambling, prostitution, tracking down stolen property, and exposing false identities. One of his early identifications was Richard M. Gordon, or Red Shirt Gordon, who would appear later in a couple of the upcoming episodes. Well, the public noticed. They began asking a reasonable question. Why was Max walking a patrol beat instead of working as a detective? The Sacramento Bee answered bluntly, because of the incompetents on the force, who have poles and who could not see a clue if they had a photograph of it, desire that they should attain to as much glory as men who know their businesses, these competent men who have been placed on beats in the same position exactly as the incompetents, and with probably far less chance to do any work. Police departments ran on favoritism, and Sacramento was no exception. 2 detectives already held the title. Neither inspired much confidence. One of them, Mike Fisher, no relation, was known for arrogance and temper, neither of which helped solve crimes. But Max didn't get worked up about it. He just kept doing his thing. Then, in January 1900, everything changed. John E. Sullivan became chief of police. He was exactly what the department needed. The new mayor gave Sullivan something rare: independence. No interference, no favors. Just do what you feel is best. And Sullivan cleaned house. He imposed discipline. Officers weren't allowed to loiter, drink, or smoke while on duty. He enforced standards. Their uniforms had to be pristine. Even their shoes better be shiny. He also ended favoritism. Best of all, he made Max Fisher a city detective. Mike Fisher would eventually leave the department, and there was no love lost. A core group of officers emerged, men who would later be known as the old-timers, trusted, respected, and very professional. They became the backbone of the department for decades. Max was at the center of it. Sullivan relied heavily on him. He said, "I make a point to have Detective Max Fisher at all trains on which convicts are known to be. One good look at a criminal is better than a photograph." And Max improved the photographs. He pushed for better use of photography at crime scenes, unidentified bodies, which hadn't been done before. No one ever thought to photograph an unidentified body before. So add photography to his long list of talents. He took all of the photographs for the department and for the coroner's office. He also did all the wanted posters, or circulars as they were called. It was around this time that a man pulled a gun on Max. He didn't retreat. In fact, he stepped closer, calmly, deliberately, close enough to hold the man's attention while 2 officers slipped in behind and disarmed him. People began asking for him by name. He had that effect. Fearless, humble, brilliant, trusted. A kind of reluctant superhero, though he would have hated the comparison. But really, Captain America before Captain America. What made it more remarkable was that none of it came from formal education. Max never attended high school or college. He taught himself. He read everything he could find, studied everything he saw. He read fiction extensively. He once said Victor Hugo's Les Miserables was his favorite book. He said, "The noble character of Jean Valjean, although somewhat tainted with crime, portrayed a real man. However, it was the detective that I admired the most, his regard for law and his doggedness in running down crime. The man's work should be an example to our detectives who track the modern criminal." By late 1900, Max was firmly established as a city detective, and he recommended Officer John Fitzgerald for promotion to detective, and Sullivan agreed. Together, they became inseparable. Newspapers began treating them as one person. Another clever capture by Fisher and Fitzgerald. Fisher and Fitzgerald make another arrest. Fisher and Fitzgerald are investigating, and so on and so forth. Then came February 17th, 1902. Hugh Duffy was watering his lawn when he saw 2 burglars enter his neighbor's empty home. he intervened. One of the burglars, a boy really, was caught. The other fired from a window and Duffy died where he stood. Both burglars then fled. The only real clue was a hat, an Army-issued one, left behind. Descriptions were sparse because the two suspects had smeared black soot on their faces. When Fisher heard about the hat, he asked if it had an oil stain on it. Well, it did. Max had seen it that morning. He'd been riding a streetcar at 3rd and J when he noticed a young man wearing it. The hat tilted, and the man's stare was hostile. The moment was brief, but enough. Weeks passed and nothing, though. Then, 2 months later, a sheriff in Salt Lake City arrested a man for stealing chickens. He resembled the suspect, and a witness claimed the man had bragged about a California murder. Sacramento wanted him extradited, but his defense attorneys resisted. Even Utah officials doubted any man could be identified from a seconds-long glance months earlier. They made a condition. Extradition would proceed if Max Fisher identified him. This was big news. The press arrived in droves. The Sacramento Union wrote, "The supreme moment of Fisher's professional career had arrived, the critical moment which was to shatter or uphold his reputation." About 30 men stood in line. No hats, no coats, no hints. Max walked slowly down the row and stopped when he looked at the third man from the end, then pointed. "There is the man I saw." His name was Charles Wardrip, and he was the man who had just been arrested. He denied he had anything to do with the murder, but a month later in Sacramento, he confessed. When asked who deserved credit, Max said, "Sheriff Naylor of Salt Lake. The people of Sacramento should take their hats off to this man." He meant it. Wardrip later requested execution, but the judge refused his guilty plea, had him examined by a doctor for insanity, and then ordered a trial. Well, Wardrip reversed himself and denied everything, but it didn't matter. He was convicted. The night before his execution in 1904, his attorney said Wardrip admitted the truth, that Max Fisher had been right all along. So, how did he do it? How could Max remember a face seen only once, sometimes for seconds, and recognize it again, years, even decades later? His career was filled with such moments. Headlines struggled to explain it. Fisher's mind baffles. The unfailing memory of Max P. Fisher. One glance was enough. Max Fisher never forgets them. He became known as the man who doesn't forget. He said, "The matter is really quite simple. If I deem a strange face of possible future interest to me, I simply focus it in my mind, quickly individualize the different feature parts, and center strongest on the expression, making the eyes my main point. The eyes I hold are justly called the windows of the soul. Next, I calculate the possible effects of either artificial or natural changes. After this riveting, the face so depicted in my mind, mentally photographing it, as it were, I further classify it into the particular group of faces of to me well-known persons of a similar type. I usually experience little difficulty in reviving it when again I come face to face with the same individual, no matter where or how dressed." Now you can understand why he did all the photography for the department. A good picture which gives the expression of the eyes is essential to criminal identification. The crooks themselves know this. When they are being mugged, getting their mugshot taken, they will try to screw up their eyes, blink, anything to muddle the image of the expression. Next to the expression of the eyes, the expression of the entire face is necessary. The expression depends upon the muscles of the face and can never be entirely altered, although operations have been undergone by criminals to change their expression. I will include a link where you can actually see some of the photographs he took. So the eyes mattered most. He said, "Your eyes will always give you away. The eyes are always the means by which a criminal can be apprehended. They do not change in color or expressions. Lines may come around them, but they retain their original expression." Memory, he insisted, could be trained. Anyone could do it, with discipline. But the photograph had to be right. Criminals knew this. They blinked, they squinted, they tried to hide themselves. Despite all that, he said, "When I see a face, I will always recognize it again, no matter when or where." He once explained it using a camera. Standing beside a large plate camera, he told a reporter, "Look there. Do you know the function of a lens? It is the eye of the camera. It merely reflects on a sensitive plate the image before it. No lens on earth can retain a picture. And so it is with the eye, which is the lens of the brain. Prepare your brain to forever retain a picture given it, then adjust your lens at the best focus to view the picture. Never stand too close to your subject. You can't tell what a man really looks like when you are close to him. Don't you know that when a crook walks into a bank to pass a bad check, he keeps his head down until he's as near to the cashier as possible. In the brief close-up, the cashier sees an image out of focus, and afterwards he has no accurate idea of what the man looked like. That is why a one-eyed person remembers faces better than a two-eyed person. He has no focus to adjust. Watch out for the one-eyed fellow if he sees you commit a crime." So the brain was the plate and the eye was the lens. Focused properly and the image stayed forever. Not everyone admired this. In July 1902, shortly after Wardrop's conviction, a letter appeared in the Sacramento Bee from a man named M. Coffey, complaining about how the city spent tax dollars, how the mayor was weak and inefficient, and then wrote, "Our present chief of police has wrapped himself up in one man, a dime novel detective, and has ignored all the rest of his officers to the detriment of the service and created an injustice to the taxpayers." Ugh, how dare he? I think I took more offense than Max probably ever did, because it didn't slow him down. He and Fitzgerald continued to work, and other cities began requesting his help. Stockton invited him to assist during their street fair. He did, and he got results. Meanwhile, Chinatown's gambling houses presented a difficult challenge. They had lookouts. Watchmen posted outside to ring alarms the moment police approached. By the time officers entered, the evidence had vanished. Max adapted. He attached a fishnet to a long bamboo pole, slipped quietly into position, and dropped the net over the lookout before the alarm could sound. It was absurd, yet effective. If there was a way in, Max found it. In 1903, 13 prisoners escaped from Folsom. Max joined the hunt immediately. Some of the escapees were men he'd arrested himself, including Richard Redshirt Gordon and Ray Fahey. There were shootouts, pursuits, long days, and longer nights. The fiasco ended in executions, number 19 and 20, which you'll hear about soon. Then came 1904, and M. Coffey again. The letter writer became the police chief. Martin Coffey had no meaningful law enforcement experience that I could point to. But in those days, appointments often followed loyalty, not ability. Mayor W.J. Hassett gave him the job, and everyone knew what it meant. Even before Coffey took office, it was clear Max Pinkerton Fisher would be targeted. On January 2nd, 1904, the Sacramento Bee wrote, "Fisher is one of the best officers the city has ever seen. He has performed his duty fearlessly, tirelessly, with keen intelligence, and for having done his duty, the politicians, in the words of Bill Nye, would take him kindly by the hand, lead him around behind the barn, take a club, and knock him in the head. Fisher cannot be broken absolutely, for he is a member of the police force and, unlike the chief, cannot be removed for political reasons. But he can be shorn of his detective's badge and put out on the arcade beat, as the district east of 12th Street is facetiously called by the patrolmen. Which is exactly what happened. The arcade beat was exile in uniform, sparse, industrial, and empty, a cannery, an almond plant, and Max Fisher. He will practically be shelved and silenced, the paper wrote. And Max answered the only way he ever did, with dignity. There are other good men on the force besides me, fully competent to fill my present position. I am perfectly willing to do patrol duty to the best of my ability on any beat to which I may be assigned. I have done so before and can do it again. I have no mortgage on the position and shall not at all feel aggrieved over it, for I fully realize the fact that to the victor comes the spoils. I will at least have this one satisfaction, that my removal is not due to misbehavior or disobedience of orders on my part. I have no time to spare worrying over that which is perfectly natural. In politics, every man likes to reward his friends. He finished with, whoever my successor may be, I wish him the best of success. He will find lots of work here at all times, and if at any time I can aid him in a case, I am not constituted so as to say no, provided, of course, he cares to avail himself of my well-intended proffer. He didn't argue, he didn't plead, he accepted it and even wished his replacement well. The paper wasn't so restrained. It reminded readers that the new chief had once dismissed Fisher as a dime-novel detective and fired back. Those who know Fisher's work are well aware that Fisher is a man who does things, and the man who does things in life is likely to be as interesting as the man who does things in a book. Fisher has been tireless in his service to the city. He has reduced the records of the department to a system never before attempted in Sacramento under any police administration. They went further, saying he built cases and saved taxpayers thousands, and for that he was being punished, reduced, and humiliated. Fitzgerald wasn't spared either. The paper wrote, Fitzgerald has always been a faithful and intelligent officer, and his zeal on the force has been second only to that of Max P. Fisher. Of course, Max responded with characteristic deflection. I certainly feel very grateful for this tribute paid me, but I cannot accept it for myself alone, as without the aid of our retiring chief and without the full and able support of my colleague, Detective John Fitzgerald. As to Chief Sullivan, he requires no endorsement at my hands, for the taxpayers have fully expressed their well-merited opinion of his, in my opinion, most successful administration. But as to my associate for the past 4 years, my loyal friend for over 15 years, I feel that a few words at this time, in view of the fact that in the near future we both expect to return to patrol duty, I will not be amiss. In many cases, and some of them quite important ones, in which we were successful, I have not only greatly profited by his able judgment, but found that his theory on the case was paramount to mine. A true and reasonable man, a loyal friend, a fearless and strictly honest officer, a competent judge of human nature, is my estimation of John Fitzgerald, and I hope that whoever our successors may be, they will bear to each other the same respect, confidence, and bonds of friendship which exist between myself and my colleague. So even while being dismantled, he built others up. On January 26, 1904, Martin Coffey officially took control, and the purge began immediately. Experienced officers were pushed aside, given desk jobs, patrol wagons, and empty beats. Meanwhile, inexperienced men filled critical positions, and neglected them. Theodore Canning, a respected night sergeant, was reassigned to driving the patrol wagon. Even officers who disliked Max personally admitted the truth. One called him a crank on doing his duty, but added he had more detective ability than the rest of the force combined. Then came another blow. On February 27, 1904, John Fitzgerald died suddenly at home. He was 40, just 3 years younger than Fisher. Max lost his partner, friend, his closest ally, and things kept getting worse. In March, Coffey admitted he allowed officers to beat a suspect who resisted arrest. The man's crime was simple. He was black, and he had been riding in a buggy with a white woman. Under Coffey, gambling exploded. Officers drank openly while on duty, and discipline vanished. An investigation followed where Coffey performed poorly. He couldn't explain basic criminal law, didn't understand ordinances, didn't even seem to understand the job. Max remained calm and precise when he testified to how illegal gambling had been controlled before and how it now flourished. He presented evidence, records, facts. And when asked whether he objected to his demotion, he said no. He was satisfied with his assignment, that he was delighted with the job and his only desire was to remain there. When asked if he felt unassisted by any of the other officers or seen any jealousy within the force, he asked to be excused. He simply wouldn't indulge in complaining or gossiping. The board voted and Coffey stayed. The press called the investigation a farce. One headline read, "Whitewash, pure as the drifted snow." The fact was, crime went up and arrests went down. Max and another skilled officer were reassigned to weed duty, burning brush along empty roads. He was kept away from the train station where he'd once identified fugitives, kept away from voter fraud investigations, and kept away from crime. It was intentional. Minority board members demanded his reinstatement, but they were ignored. Even detectives from other cities spoke up. Edward Gibson, a respected San Francisco detective, publicly called Fisher one of the best in the state, which was a high compliment because at the time, detectives rarely praised detectives from other cities, especially when the two cities competed for everything like Sacramento and San Francisco did. It didn't matter. If anything, it hardened Coffey's resolve. Sacramento's reputation collapsed. Other cities noticed, and so did criminals. Illegal gambling flourished. Officers drank openly in gambling halls, and the city officials joined them. Citizens had enough, and a large group of them formed the Law and Order League. One of its founding members was former Congressman Grove L. Johnson. Pressure mounted on a grand jury, and charges were filed against Mayor Hassett and Chief Coffey for neglect of duty. But there was a problem. No one seemed entirely sure who had the authority to remove them. The courts, the mayor, the board, no one agreed. And what followed was a year-long stalemate. Legal battles, political maneuvering, open favoritism, and through it all, Max waited. Working, watching, remembering. Coffey even went after Max directly. One day, while on patrol, Max spotted a burglary in progress just outside his assigned beat. He did exactly what good officers do. He called the station, got permission from the desk sergeant, pursued it, and gathered substantial evidence. Then he returned to his post. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Coffey called him in and unleashed. Several officers overheard the exchange, and rumors spread immediately. The press caught wind of it. At first, Fisher declined comment, but word filtered out anyway, and one paper dryly noted it seemed to be the chief who got the tongue lashing. Eventually, Max gave his account. He had explained the situation, Coffey responded by saying the department already had evidence and Fisher had no business gathering more, and from now on he would need the chief's personal permission to leave his beat. Max told the reporter, "I was undecided as to whether I had heard right or not, so Chief Coffey repeated his rebuke. After collecting myself for a moment, I said, 'With all due respect to you, Chief Coffey, I accept to your rebuke for trying to do my duty to those who pay your salary and mine. I consider it unjust and certainly calculated to discourage. It appears to me that by this order, you either repudiate your own written instruction to the entire force that all permission to leave the beat must come from the sergeant, or else you wish all important info to be handled by and all important arrests to be made by just 3 or 4 men, while I and other patrol officers are to be marionettes on our own beats. You have stood us up in line and have publicly criticized officers Bagley, Malone, Cripp, Ribble, Plunkett, and myself for not making arrests, and threatened to bring us before the Board of Trustees for not being more vigilant and active. Now, when I am trying to do something, when I am endeavoring to catch this burglar, who would have been in jail long ago had I had his description when I met him a block from the jail, instead of encouraging me, you send me for rebuke. Who is responsible for the many crimes this man has committed since this information has been in your hands?" Calm, direct, unapologetic, he accused Coffey, politely but unmistakably, of discouraging police work, contradicting his own standing orders, and protecting criminals through inaction. That ended the conversation, but Coffey's response was swift. He reassigned Fisher to jail duty, where, the press wrote, he can give the public no service beyond accompanying the patrol wagon to bring in a harmless drunk while criminals walk the streets. It was punishment, pure and simple, but Coffey wasn't finished embarrassing himself. In January 1905, he released his annual report, and it was so absurd, one editor titled his response, "Chief Coffey, the Unconscious Humorist." The editor wrote, "Surely nothing in the heavens above, the earth beneath, or the waters under the earth could be 1/10 so humorous as the unintentionally but excruciatingly funny public documents put forth by this official, who is all the more humorous because he is entirely unconscious that he is humorous." In his annual report, Coffey blamed the press, saying their headlines sparked citizen fear. He claimed crime wasn't rising, despite records proving otherwise. He blamed the theater for allowing certain plays that turned boys into criminals. He said, "Telephone offices and department stores are nothing more than kindergartens of vice for young girls. These occupations, according to the chief, exposed girls to, quote, vices like prostitution because of the phone conversations and the silk stockings, diamonds, etc." He blamed everything else but himself. He also made no mention whatsoever of the gambling epidemic consuming the city. One of the minority board members told the press, "His report is an honest confession that his present detective force and the officers who are close up are capable of catching and detecting nothing but boys and drunks. In fact, to be candid, I don't think they could track an elephant in a snowstorm." As citizens were furious, business owners protested, telephone operators protested, the press ridiculed him openly, and still he remained in power. Then came something worse. In August, Coffey illegally detained 2 suspects, denying them attorneys. They remained locked up until another prisoner could smuggle out a note, leading an attorney to file a petition. They were released and evidently innocent. It raised disturbing questions, including about William Gray, arrested earlier that year by Coffey himself. Gray would later become Folsom's 22nd execution, and I always questioned his guilt. For Max, the only escape from Coffey was the river. Fishing was his refuge. He loved bass fishing and designed his own lures. He studied fish with the same intensity he studied criminals. In December 1904, the Sacramento Star reported a massive striped bass on display, quote, which is popularly believed to have been caught by Max P. Fisher, whose reputation as a fish catcher is second only to that which he enjoys as a thief catcher. But Max, with his customary modesty, disclaims the honor. Of course he did, but he happily explained in exhaustive detail the lure design, such as the weight, the size, number of hooks, feathers, how this related to the weight of the fish, and the different bodies of water, river, lake, saltwater, the depth of the water, then the clarity of the water, and finally the speed and motion of the cast. Everything was data to Max. Everything had a pattern waiting to be understood. He became a recognized authority on river fish. And true to form, he turned even fishing into detective work. At Lake Alta, he solved two mysteries at once: why large bass stayed put, and why dead catfish washed ashore. He described it vividly, this bass brigade, how the mother fish guarded her young in these territorial battles with catfish. It read less like fishing and more like surveillance, because to Max it was. Observation was observation, whether criminal or fish. The same mind at work with the same patience, the same relentless curiosity. Even then, he was still watching, still studying, still telling stories. And this particular one I'll provide a link to, because it also illustrated his humorous and fun side. He liked a good joke, and even playing practical jokes on his colleagues, such as when he tried to fool them while dressed up in undercover garb. He also wrote humorous newspaper pieces celebrating Sacramento's Gold Rush past, where participants called themselves Whiskerinos, referencing the beards so synonymous with these intrepid gold miners. Anyhow, during these fishing trips, Max naturally became the campfire's master of ceremonies, the storyteller everyone drifted toward once the flames settled and the night grew quiet. So it surprised no one. In July 1904, while camping in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a group of YMCA boys asked him to speak, or perhaps he simply volunteered. It's not hard to imagine either. He told them, "Tonight I wish to warn each one of you boys to obey your parents and to be honest. Home is the place where many boys begin a criminal career by lying." He explained how one lie demanded another and another, until home became something to escape. Hunger led to theft, and theft to prison. "Boys," he said, "it makes me sad many times to do this work, but it is my duty. Now, boys, I hope I will never have to come after you to place you in confinement, and I know I won't have to, provided you obey your parents." It was the beginning of something new. Max Fisher, lecturer. From newspaper accounts alone, he gave at least 50 talks over the years. He spoke to warn, to teach, to guide, to explain the law, his methods, and the consequences of ignoring both. And eventually he'd speak in far bigger rooms. A year later, 1905, he returned to the YMCA with a lecture titled "From Hooky to Tuffy, and from Tuffy to Jail." He told them plainly, boys who play hooky must lie when they get home. They must necessarily deceive their mothers as well as their teachers. From hooky, it is only a short jump to cigarettes and craps, and from these to drink and ultimate ruin is only a step. Then he brought it home. At all times, take your mother's advice. Be sure to obey her, and above all things, respect your mother. When you respect your own mother, you will also respect the mothers of other boys. If you follow this rule, you will not be so apt to do wrong. To make the point, he told them about a boy who skipped school, lied, ran away, fell in with criminals, committed burglary, and ended at the gallows. The boy was Charles Wardrip. Even as the department sidelined him, Max continued fighting for young offenders. He pushed for prisons to have reformatories in them. He believed punishment without rehabilitation was just recycling failure. And, despite being at the edge of the department, his skills were still needed. In July 1905, he was called to examine a suspicious box left on a man's porch, a crude explosive device triggered by opening the lid. The homeowner claimed a woman with a grudge had planted it and even provided handwriting samples to prove it. To an untrained officer, the case would have appeared obvious enough, a reporter wrote, but Fisher deemed it deeper than it showed on the surface. He studied everything, the device, the handwriting, and the man, and in the end proved the man built it himself. Even in exile, he was still the best investigator in the room. By the end of 1905, it was obvious nothing would come of the charges against Coffey. His term was ending anyway. Another farce, the papers said. But there was hope. A new mayor was elected and a new chief appointed, M.R. Denny. Unfortunately, little changed. Max stayed where he was, and as always, he didn't complain. He just kept working. Politics still ruled everything, especially gambling. Officials protected their own interests by pretending otherwise. When Denny assigned Fisher and Officer Plunkett to investigate a cigar store rumored to house illegal gambling, they quickly confirmed it and shut it down. One editor noted dryly, the big powers that be knew Fisher and Plunkett could close a gambling joint by merely going to the proprietors and telling them they had better close. See, everyone understood what was really happening. They weren't enforcing the law, they were enforcing politics and using good officers as pawns to clear out competitors. Worse, evidence Max gathered would sometimes vanish before trial, lost, altered, or simply gone. He was also forced to make arrests he personally disagreed with, like an elderly man selling peanuts illegally on the streets. Then, in May 1907, came a moment of quiet vindication. Under the brutal headline, City Detectives Admit Their Incompetence, the Sacramento Bee reported, as a confession of their own inability, incompetency, inefficiency, stupidity, and general unfitness for the positions they hold, city detectives Pennish and Ryan, after 13 days of working on a case, threw their hands up and called upon Fisher for help. The victim herself knew what that meant. They did the best they knew how, she said, but you know as well as I do that they are not fitted for the positions they hold. She personally requested Max. It took some intervention from the city attorney to make it happen, but within one day, Max accomplished what they could not in 13. When it comes to detective work, I don't think Max Fisher has his equal, she said. And then, in perfect Fisher fashion, he stepped aside and let another officer make the arrest. The suspect confessed. Max never needed credit, just the truth. And as I say, the press had a field day. Citizens, they said, increasingly asked for Fisher by name because the current detectives weren't getting it done. After one burglary, the paper deadpanned, Detectives Pennish and Ryan are investigating. No arrests. Later, Max Fisher may be requested to assist. And another, former Detective Max Fisher may be called into the case if the police department decides to make a real effort to catch the criminals and stop crime. Max never gloated. That wasn't his way. I will, though. Still, I suspect his real satisfaction came from something simpler, being useful again. Then came a scare. The press wrote, Max Fisher is dying. Max Fisher, one of the most efficient members of the local police force and one of the most competent detectives in the state, is lying at the point of death. The doctors declare there is little hope for recovery. He was stricken while on vacation. While fishing, he had contracted erysipelas, or St. Elmo's fire as it was called, a bacterial infection that untreated could turn deadly. He recovered, but slowly. 5 weeks he was off duty, but according to one report, there was a, quote, daily pilgrimage to his house by people with detective matters for him. Even on his deathbed, people still needed Max Fisher. Once recovered, he returned, just in time to confront a new menace: the automobile. In 1905, Sacramento had just 27 registered cars. By 1910, it had 700. By 1911, at times during that year, 75 cars were sold per day. It was, as one paper put it, an auto frenzy. And Max was not impressed. One paper said he's credited with making Sacramento's first automobile arrest. Fisher was complimented by the court for his attitude and arrest of fast motorists. Fisher seems to be the only man on the force with any desire to uphold this ordinance. If you were speeding, he'd actually step directly into the street, stop you cold, climb in, and make you drive him and yourself to jail. Some assumed he hated cars. He clarified, "I am not against the machines, but I am after the man who recklessly and willfully violates the law, and I don't care a rap whether he is rich or poor, high or low. They all look alike to me. The law applies equally to all." He understood the value of a car and what it brought to society. He just didn't tolerate arrogance. They are also a rich man's luxury, he said, before pointing out how the same men who complained about poor cyclists cutting across sidewalks would howl when arrested for barreling through crowded streets in a 2-ton machine. 2 pedestrians had already been killed. Max had seen enough. "I want to say right here," he continued, "that it is not so much the licensed chauffeurs, but the private owners and the rich man and the rich man's sons, and likewise some of our prominent merchants who, in their race for the mighty dollar, forget there is a little corner on this earth reserved for the poor man and his wife and children." It wasn't just about safety. It was about example, because children watched everything. And Max believed law without example meant nothing. A reporter wrote, "Some automobilists complain they find it impossible to comply with the present speed ordinance in Sacramento. That is too bad, for the ordinance is a very salutary one in the best interests of the citizens generally. Still, if they think they cannot comply therewith, Officer Max Fisher might show them a way." He meant it. Not on his watch. Or, more precisely, his stopwatch. Because Max devised his own system to measure speed. He calculated block distances, timed vehicles, and converted seconds into miles per hour in his head. If a car covered a block in 12.5 seconds, 23 miles per hour, a violation. No arguing, no guessing, just math. Some drivers absolutely hated it, but most respected him for it. The automobilists had better go slow when on Officer Max Fisher's beat, the papers warned. Max himself said simply, "If the speed limit, as it is now fixed by law, is too tame for them, let them get the law repealed or amended." I highly recommend the book, Policing the Open Road: How Cars Transformed American Freedom, by Sarah So. It gives a fantastic history of law enforcement and the automobile. Then finally, everything changed. January 1908, Johnny Sullivan returned as police chief. And just like that, order returned with him. Sullivan reinstated Fisher as detective, as well as Fred Cripp, who Max worked alongside quite a bit the previous year. They were also very good friends. The city approved instantly. The new detectives will rank among the best pair of sleuths in the state, the Sacramento Star wrote. Max Fisher is repeated as having no superiors as a faceman and all-around detective west of Chicago. Feared by the law-breaking element, he will be an invaluable public servant to the city of Sacramento. His partner, Fred Cripp, was for many years a guard at Folsom State Prison. Then the line that mattered most. Just leave it to Fisher and Cripp. And criminals quickly relearned why. Quote, "It is very foolish for burglars to burgle in and about Sacramento," wrote one paper, "and then hope to dispose the loot successfully while Detective Max Fisher is around. When it comes to burglars, Fisher's heart turns to stone, and he's a regular bloodhound for running them down." Max was back, and Sacramento's criminals knew it. It was like Fisher and Fitzgerald all over again. Fisher and Cripp became inseparable in the papers, their names appearing almost daily. They worked relentlessly, 16, sometimes 18 hours at a stretch, quietly carrying workloads meant for several men. They built their cases, closed them cleanly, and moved on without fanfare. Cripp's years at Folsom meant he knew the revolving cast of convicts firsthand, and paired with Fisher's records and his mind, which was its own filing system, the message to criminals was unmistakable. Sacramento was no longer an easy town. In March, the pair made a major arrest. Antonio Sapala, Folsom's 24th execution. Fisher's role in that case was significant, so you'll hear about that one soon. June 1908 was particularly busy for the detectives, and one incident left its mark. A couple, actually. Attempting to arrest a wanted man, Fisher was punched hard in the stomach. The suspect bolted, but Fisher gave chase anyway and was compelled to bring him down by shooting the man in the leg. He fired twice. The second bullet entered the hole the first bullet made. Even by today's standards, that's remarkable. But in 1908, with a .38 caliber double-action revolver, that marvel was talked about in the department for decades. Even his stomach issue lingered, and he underwent surgery the following year, and references later suggest it affected his health permanently, but you wouldn't have known it. The work never slowed. Within 6 months of Fisher and Cripp's partnership, crime noticeably declined. One paper wrote in regard to one arrest, "Such captures as that put fear in the hearts of the crooks, and they give Sacramento a wide berth." Fisher returned to what he did best, recognizing faces others forgot. A man from a 9-year-old memory, another from 14 years prior, one from 20. In one instance, he noticed a missing piece of a man's left ear, opened his scar book to page 180, and confirmed it instantly. A mole, a scar, a tattoo. Nothing escaped him. When a U.S. Marshal needed counterfeiters found, Fisher and Cripp delivered them both, and confessions, in just 6 hours. A reporter said, "The story of the case made out against the men by the Sacramento sleuths reads like fiction. It is a tale involving a bit of the cleverest detective work performed in this city in recent years. They just knew where to track the men." And that was just Max Fisher. By 1909, he was everywhere again. Murder cases, identifications, voter fraud investigations. A third detective, James Richards, joined them. The papers called him Sherlock III. Cripp was the Dr. Watson to Fisher's Sherlock. Then everything unraveled again. In November, Fisher underwent stomach surgery. Soon after, Cripp was demoted following an alcohol and gun-related incident. Never a good thing. No one was hurt, but I wasn't able to find anything more than that on it. And then came the familiar blow. A new chief. This one, William Ahern. Fisher was relegated to patrol again. The pay cut from $110 to $100 a month was almost beside the point. Citizens reacted with the same disbelief they always had, and one reporter wrote, "Fisher possesses all the qualifications that go to make up a good detective." He described his memory, his discipline, his exhaustive preparation, how lawyers couldn't break his cases, and criminals feared his reputation. Judges praised him openly. Another wrote that Fisher loved detective work so much he'd work 24 straight hours and often paid his own expenses to do it. And yet there he was, back on patrol. Max, as always, accepted it without bitterness. I am perfectly satisfied with the change and will continue to contribute my best efforts for good old Sacramento. A patrolman can do a lot of good on his beat. For my successors, I have nothing but the sincerest wishes to see them make good records. As to the new chief, I will say that I have known Mr. Ahern for nearly 20 years, and knowing him as I do, I feel satisfied that he will make a fearless and capable chief of police. I stand ready at any and all times to do my very best to aid him in making his police administration a success. He even praised the chief, and he meant it. Or at least, he chose to say it. But Max Fisher understood something most people never do. Titles didn't make him who he was, and titles didn't take it away. Still, it's hard not to wonder if part of him knew something else. That his story wasn't finished. That the next chapter was already waiting. Join me next week for part 2 of this story and the conclusion of Max P. Fisher, the man who didn't forget. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on the show page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also find links to YouTube and to Patreon, where I provide bonus material, including bonus episodes. I'll release 1 to 2 new episodes each month, always on Fridays, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.